going on, and it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Good morning, it's 9:30 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and your radio. Today, those P&O sackings have sparked a fire and rehire Westminster vote. Should Ukraine negotiate with Russia? What can Rishi do to help with our cost of living? And I'll analyse whether Boris really did compare Ukraine's fight with the Brexit vote. Is it a little bit more complicated than that? You won't want to miss it all. It coming after your morning headlines.
Good morning, it's just gone 9:30. I'm Simon Pusey in the GB newsroom. Ukraine has refused to surrender in the port city of Mariupol, where residents are besieged with little food, power and water. Russia had given fighters in the city until 5 a.m. to lay down their weapons in exchange for safe passage out, but they refused. Many of the city's 400,000 citizens remain trapped. Emergency services in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, are trying to rescue people from a shelled shopping centre. A video from Ukraine's state emergency service shows a large blast in the northwest suburbs of the city. Mayor Vitaly Klitschko has said shelling hit residential houses and a shopping district. At least 8 people have been killed. A Chinese airliner with 132 people on board has crashed in the southern province of Guangxi, causing a fire on the mountainside. That's according to state media. China Central Television said the jet involved in the accident was a Boeing 737 aircraft flying from the city of Kunming to Guangzhou. The number of casualties is not currently known. Labour is forcing an emergency vote in Parliament today following the sacking of 800 P&O ferry workers. The party wants to outlaw so-called fire and rehire practices after the operator replaced staff with cheaper agency workers. Labour is to call on the government to suspend contracts with the company's owners until the matter is resolved. The government has urged the firm to pause the changes and says it's examining the contracts it holds with them. And Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe will speak publicly alongside her husband for the first time since her release from Iran. The British Iranian landed back in Britain last Thursday after the UK agreed finally to settle a £400 million debt dating back to the 1970s. She'd been detained in Iran for 6 years. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. Now it's back to The Briefing with Tom Harwood.
Good morning, it's 9:33 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, on your TV and on your radio. Now, Labour is forcing an emergency vote in Parliament today following the sacking of 800 P&O ferry workers. The party wants to outlaw so-called fire and rehire practices after the operator replaced staff with cheaper agency workers. Now, over the weekend, Chancellor Rishi Sunak called the move by P&O awful and wrong, confirming that the government is examining the legality of the firm's actions. Well, let's talk through what's happening in Parliament today now with Paul Connu, media commentator and former editor of the Sunday Mirror. Now, there are many figures within the Labour Party who've been talking about fire and rehire practices for quite some time, although it doesn't seem that that's particularly analogous in this case because it's not the same workers being rehired, it's different agency staff. Are Labour trying to conflate two different issues today?
Not really, because I think the fire and rehire situation needs to be rectified anyway. And the government, of course, blocked a private member's bill to outlaw fire and hire not so long ago. This time, it'll be interesting if this comes to a vote today, how many Tory MPs vote with Labour on it. I think that's a distinct possibility. I mean, this has been a PR disaster for P&O Ferries and its parent company in Dubai, DB World. But whether they realise the degree of public outrage, I wonder. And I think hopefully we'll see a lot of British people voting with their feet, and with their wallets by using rival ferry operators.
It was interesting at the Conservative Party's spring conference over the weekend to see just how many cabinet ministers were really willing to use pretty harsh language about P&O, almost more condemnation on the way in which this was done. The pre-recorded Zoom call firing people with no notice. Do you think perhaps that the way in which it was done was potentially the largest problem here?
I think it's certainly a big part of the problem, although not entirely the problem. For once, I agreed with the Archbishop of Canterbury. I don't always agree with when he called it sinful as well as inhumane and unethical. And rather embarrassing, too, for, if you like, the Brexiteers, because DB World have taken advantage of the Brexit scenario. Having British seamen taken off by security guards armed with handcuffs and replaced by foreign agency workers, some of whom, it's said, are earning £1.80 an hour compared to the British legal wage of £8.91. I mean, this is hardly the great world of Brexit Unchained Britain that was sold, and I think government ministers have got to dig their heels in here.
But are we being a bit too...
are heavily involved in Freeport arrangements, and I think that they should be kicked out of any unless they do a U-turn, which seems unlikely at the moment, that they should be excluded from any of the Freeport deals.
I suppose that seems like it's a reasonable step to take, given that it wouldn't be banning a free action of a company, because I do worry here that potentially we're looking at this from only one side. Of course, the ferry industry has had a really torrid time, as many industries involved in travel have over the last 2 years. Clearly, it's not in a particularly healthy financial footing. Doesn't a company have a right to restructure, to say that parts of its business are too expensive to run and that without changes it might go out of business?
Well, there's one thing which struck me over the weekend is that DB World, the parent company, are spending £147 million sponsoring the European Golf Tour this year, but they still owe £146 million to the Merchant Seamen's Pension Fund, which they haven't paid. So I don't think this company exactly have a reputation that we should be defending at the moment.
But there is a fundamental point here, isn't there, that if we're going to restrict the actions of a company, potentially with some pretty heavy-handed regulation affecting how employers can fire people. I think there's a relative amount of research showing that sort of banning people from firing people can often lead to just more bankruptcies of companies, and actually everyone gets fired in the end anyway. Is there a worry that we might be leaning too heavily onto trying to regulate something that, whilst it's a desperately sad situation, potentially there were no good answers here?
I don't think so, because you have to look at it in the context of the deep pockets of DB World. And let's not forget that P&O Ferries received somewhere between 10 and 15 million in furlough money during the pandemic, which I hope the government will be trying to explore ways of clawing back. Plus the fact is that this company may well, it's an arguable point, because some of the vessels are registered in Cyprus and the Bahamas, but that they seem to have broken the law potentially on failing the required consultation process when you are imposing mass sackings as opposed to individual sackings. I think there's going to be a legal fight over this, which the government have given them until 5 p.m. tomorrow to explain themselves, while government lawyers are consulting on on whether this is legal, illegal, or or what. But the trouble with that is that any legal challenges are going to take weeks or months, and then there'll probably be an appeal. So we could be looking at a couple of years before there's any legal resolution to this, which is why today in Parliament really matters. And I think there could be quite a cross-party consensus today in Parliament, Tom.
Well, let's keep an eye out for that emergency vote taking place today. I think you're completely right. It will be interesting to see what some of those backbench Tories do in response to that Labour call. Well, thank you for joining me, Paul Connew, former editor of the Sunday Mirror, this morning to talk through that important issue today. Now, elsewhere in foreign affairs, it's day 26 of Russia's invasion, and in the past few hours, Ukraine has rejected an ultimatum to surrender the besieged city of Mariupol, one of the key flashpoints in the war. Russia says civilians would be allowed safe passage out of the port only if the city has laid down its arms. However, Ukraine says there's no question of surrendering the strategic port city. 400,000 people are currently trapped in Mariupol with limited aid and supplies. Well, what are Ukraine's options here? Joining me now is former British Army Colonel and chemical weapons expert Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. Welcome to the programme. First of all, it's an incredibly important city, Mariupol. It's part of this land bridge that Russia is trying to create across the south of Ukraine. Is it inevitable that this city will fall?
Well, I think with the forces arrayed against them, yes, it probably is inevitable. Russia has got overwhelming force. However, it's taking a long time. The Russians thought they'd roll into a place like Mariupol in a couple of days. And as you've said, they've held out for 2 or 3 weeks. And when, looking at the Syrian playbook, which is exactly what Putin is using here, it took 4 years to take Aleppo, a town of a similar size. And Aleppo, there were 400,000 people trapped as well. And in fact, the only way they took it in the end was to use chemical weapons, which is a big concern of mine, particularly at the moment. But it is strategically important, and the Russians will hope to wrap this up pretty quickly, but I don't think they will. I think there are an awful lot of casualties to happen between now and when that happens, so that they can move on to the north.
And we're seeing this old, discredited playbook of the Russians claiming that there are these biolabs in Ukraine, something they claimed about Georgia as well, something they've claimed. They've used very peculiar sort of almost farcical sounding claims that the Americans were testing on bats and this is where COVID came from, despite being discovered on the other side of the world. To what extent is this really quite peculiar behaviour from Russia gearing up to try and make cover for potential chemical weapons attacks?
Well, unfortunately, Tom, this is what they do. The truth is something completely alien to the Russians and Putin in particular. They are trying to, through propaganda and disinformation, trying to unbalance the Ukrainians and unbalance, the Western world. And sadly, these what we call false flags, fake claims of bio and chemical attack in Syria were always the precursor for exactly that. And actually today, I have just published a booklet free on Amazon on how to survive chemical and biological attacks for the people in Ukraine, because these things are very survivable. But what you do in a chemical attack is sort of counterintuitive. People think you hide underground to get away from bombs and bullets. That's true. But if you do that with a chemical attack, the chemicals get you underground. So what I'm trying to do is educate the civilian population, as we did in Syria, and save thousands of lives. And if the Russians think that their chemical and biological attacks are going to be less effective, hopefully they won't use them. And really what we need to get the Russians to the peace table, a sue for peace and a ceasefire, because, as the Russians have said, if people don't survive surrender in Mariupol, there is going to be a disaster, and one could see tens of thousands of deaths, even more. And there will also be many Russian casualties. And that is his strategic weakness at the moment, is Russian military casualties. But of course, people in Russia are not hearing your programme. They're not getting the true story, and we need to try and get that story to them so that they can unseat this dictator.
Certainly. Well, hopefully that your message to the people of Ukraine can get out there loud and clear, that if chemical weapons are used, do not get underground, get up, out into the open air. That's the best way to survive. It's extraordinary that we're even having this discussion. Chemical weapons are, of course, weapons of mass destruction and are against all sorts of international law. I wonder, though, when you're dealing with an aggressor like Putin, when you're dealing with a country like Russia that has flagrantly disregarded international law, committed many alleged war crimes, is it right to talk to an aggressor like that? Is it right to seek a negotiated settlement?
Well, unfortunately, however unpalatable it is, Tom, one has to do this. One always has to negotiate with your enemy. You know, some of the mistakes we made in Afghanistan and Iraq was not engaging with Al-Qaeda and the Taliban and ISIS directly. One has to keep that dialogue going, because without it, there is no hope at all. And with that dialogue, hopefully the information of the dreadful pictures that you're showing now will get to the people, the Russian people in Moscow and elsewhere. And I'm sure 95% of them are moral, upstanding folk who would not want these war crimes and atrocities happening in their name. So it's unpalatable to have peace with Putin, but quite frankly, the thousands of deaths, we saw 800,000 civilians killed in Syria over the last 8 or so years. Can we really accept that sort of number of Ukrainian civilians dead, without doing something about it? We don't want to get militarily involved because that would lead to world war, but we need to do all we can to save those people who are suffering so terribly in Mariupol and the other cities in Ukraine.
It's a desperate situation. Well, Hamish de Bretton-Gordon, thank you for talking us through some of those issues there. Let's hope that something can be done to avoid that awful chemical warfare. Now to a media storm about the Prime Minister's spring conference speech over the weekend. Yesterday, the Chancellor said he did not think the fight against Russia and the vote against the EU were analogous, and neither did the Prime Minister. Neither did the Prime Minister. But The Guardian and the BBC, and just about everyone else in the media, have just asserted as fact that Boris Johnson directly compared Ukrainians fighting Putin with Brits voting for Brexit in 2016. Didn't he? Well, perhaps now it's time to look at what the Prime Minister actually said, not what was just reported. In a section about Ukraine's love of freedom, Boris Johnson spoke about a free press, markets and democratic elections. Yes, not taking up arms against an aggressor, as the media implied, but rather the love of and journey to free institutions. Let's take a listen.
Entirely different reason. He was frightened of Ukraine because in Ukraine they have a free press, and in Ukraine they have free elections. And with every year that Ukraine progressed, not always easily, towards freedom and democracy and open markets, he feared the Ukrainian example, and he feared the implicit reproach to himself. Because in Putin's Russia, you get jailed for 15 years just for calling an invasion an invasion. And if you stand against Putin in an election, you get poisoned or shot. And that is why Putin must fail. And I know that it's the instinct of the people of this country, like the people of Ukraine, to choose freedom every time. I can give you a couple of famous recent examples. When the British people voted for Brexit in such large numbers, I don't believe it was because they were remotely hostile to foreigners. It's because they wanted to be free.
It doesn't sound quite as it was reported now, does it? The examples of the Ukrainian instinct for freedom the Prime Minister had just given were of democratic processes, not of war, as just about every journalist has claimed since. This is how the BBC's Sophie Rayworth described it yesterday.
The Prime Minister said yesterday in Blackpool the comparison that he made between Ukrainians fighting Russians like British voting for Brexit.
Fighting Russians? How did free elections turn into fighting Russians? I think perhaps the BBC was reading too much of The Guardian's front page, which reported, quote, "Fury greets the PM's claim that Ukraine fight is like Brexit." But was that the claim? The Guardian newspaper did not seem all that sure when it first reported it half a day earlier. This was their report, that Boris Johnson only, quote, appears to liken Ukrainians' fight to Brexit. Appears to. An interpretation, not a fact. Yet the fact that a Twitter storm ensued with people who did not watch the full speech, which was attended and applauded by the Ukrainian ambassador, by the way, it was those people who have asserted one particular misinterpretation as the gospel truth. But there's more. Not only was the Prime Minister talking about Ukrainians' free institutions, not their fight, he made more comparisons too. Another part of the speech chopped off by broadcasters and Twitter users was the Prime Minister's very next sentence. Saying another example of Brits' love of freedom was the fact that we voluntarily got vaccinated in such large numbers.
Give you another example, where the British population came forward to be vaccinated at such incredible speed, voluntarily, unlike many other countries. I'm sure it was, of course, partly because they wanted to avoid catching COVID. But I'll tell you why people did it. Why did the British people come forward? I mean, 90% we got, entirely voluntarily. Entirely voluntarily. It was because they wanted to get on with their lives. They were fed up with being told what to do.
He was about to say, by people like me. Now, an unscrupulous journalist could claim in exactly the same way as many did via Brexit, that Boris Johnson just disgracefully compared the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to Vladimir Putin. After all, he said that the Ukrainian instinct for freedom was like Brits going to get vaccinated, quote, because they were fed up of being told what to do by people like me. If the Prime Minister had really directly compared Ukraine's fight with the Brexit vote, as was reported, then he also, in the next breath, compared himself and the actions of his government, i.e. telling people what to do, with the actions of Mr. Putin. Now, clearly that's absurd. Clearly no one at the conference saw it that way. Clearly the Ukrainian ambassador in the front row did not see it that way. And yet so much of the media, most of whom weren't actually there, by the way, so much of the media reported not on the speech, but on the manufactured and misleading Twitter content instead. And now the narrative is set. It is received wisdom that Boris said fighting Russia was like voting against the EU. All that despite it not being true. What was true, however, as a little addendum, was the fact that so many leading Remain campaigners compared Brexiteers to Nazis. Not least of all, Shadow Foreign Secretary David Lammy, who, far from doing so sheepishly, he doubled down on the claim, telling the BBC's flagship MAR programme that the comparison, quote, wasn't strong enough. But whataboutery is never particularly edifying, no matter how illuminating it may be. No, the remarkable point in this story isn't to say they're all as bad as each other, because in this case, they're not. The issue here is to ask how one absurd interpretation of a line in a speech has come to become the accepted truth in the eyes of so much of the media. How paraphrasing and context chopping has rewritten history. And that's something we should all be concerned by. Now, finally, Chancellor Rishi Sunak is set to deliver his spring statement this week, often referred to as a mini-budget. That's coming on Wednesday. With inflation spiralling, some predictions are as high as 8.3%. National insurance set to rise next month from 12% to 13.25%. And a worsening cost of living crisis. This statement will be a key part of the Chancellor's programme moving forward. Well, joining me to discuss what could be in it is Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economic and Business Research. Welcome to the programme, Vicky. First of all, we've been hearing some hints, particularly with regard to fuel duty, but also with regard to the government seeming to be sticking with this national insurance rise. What's your prediction?
On the fuel duty, which has been talked about, of course, you never know whether that will be done. The interesting thing about it is that fuel duty hasn't gone up for the last 12 years. If we had raised fuel duty in line with inflation as we had done until then, we would have been collecting about 8 billion more per annum by now. But as it is, the idea of perhaps cutting 5p of that duty, which is about 57.6 pence for every gallon of petrol you put in, would make a difference, but not a huge one. The interesting thing for the government is that, of course, because of the price being so high right now in petrol, they also get 20% VAT, which means that their pockets are lining up anyway from the higher cost because, of course, they get much more in terms of cash because of that. So they can be generous in that way. On the national insurance one, I think, yes, the pressure is or has been on to delay it by a year, but I think the most likely thing we're going to see happen is that indeed the thresholds for when you start paying that national insurance contribution will be raised, which means therefore that you leave out quite a lot of people who would have been paying extra national insurance contributions, which is of course now aimed for the National Health Service and for social care over a period of time.
That's an interesting point there, because of course the Chancellor has for the last few months been very focused on making sure that his interventions are targeted. When the Labour Party called for cutting VAT on fuel bills, the Chancellor said that would be giving handouts to millionaires, and instead he wanted to do targeted support for the bottom 80% of households. It seems like that idea when it comes to raising threshold for national insurance payment, or indeed maybe targeted support for people on fuel or anything else, is this Chancellor's worldview really to do more targeted behaviour rather than broad brush tax cuts?
We've seen that more targeted behaviour, of course, when it comes to easing the fuel bills for people. So it's people who live in households who live in houses that are lower in terms of the rateable value, which are going to be getting some of the extra benefits. So by comparison to what everyone will be getting, there's extra support now being targeted for those at the lower end. So that's certainly happening. So this 9 billion that will be costing the government to support households' energy bills is really targeted mostly to those who can least afford to pay. So that's good news. It's interesting about cars and fuel duty, because the reality is that as you go down the pay scale, a larger percentage of what you spend is on food and transport, fuel, really. So there is, again, an element of targeting to that, but of course it's going to affect everybody without any doubt. But I think there is an element of targeting that's hinted in that, if you like. But probably he will need to do an awful lot more, I'm afraid. Particularly, I think he's going to have to look at benefits. You talk about targeting. Benefits are going up by just 3.1% because the inflation that they counted it on was lower when they did so. If he were to raise that, people are saying, why not 6%? It's going to be quite expensive. Like what you're doing with the minimum wage, which is going up by 6.6% in April.
It's interesting. The minimum wage is obviously going to be good for the people receiving it, but not so good for the businesses that have to pay it. It'll be a very interesting statement on Wednesday. We'll keep very keen eyes on it. Of course, GB News is providing a special programme on Wednesday afternoon to see it. Vicky Price there, Chief Economic Advisor at the Centre for Economic and Business Research. Thank you for talking us through those issues. That's it for the programme today. We've reached the end. I'll be back at 9:30 tomorrow morning. But next, it's To The Point with Patrick and Anaya. First, though, it's the weather.
Looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking a little foggy at first, but otherwise fine with plenty of spring sunshine. Let's take a look at the details. In the southwest, there'll be some cloud around, but for many that'll be mostly sunny. Whilst you can't rule out the odd shower, it will be largely dry. In the southeast, it will be warmer than yesterday, with temperatures in the mid-teens Celsius, and it'll feel warm in those sunny spells. Much of Wales will have a largely sunny day, and as well as that, temperatures are going to be a little higher than on Sunday. There may be a little more cloud around parts of the Midlands this lunchtime. It will stay dry though, and most of us are going to see some sunshine breaking through that thick cloud. Further northeast, it'll be mostly sunny with largely blue skies. Temperature may be a little disappointing though, getting to those highs of around 10 or 11 Celsius, so similar to yesterday for many. We can expect some cloud around Aberdeenshire, and a few showers are possible near the coast too. Otherwise, it will be mostly sunny across Scotland, but not especially warm. In Northern Ireland, it's looking dry, and whilst most of us should see some sunshine at times, there'll be a little bit of cloud around, temperatures widely in the double figures. Staying fine most this afternoon and into the evening, cloudy for some, although 1 or 2 showers are possible. And that's how the weather is looking for the UK today.
GB News is the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
To stay up to date on the latest stories,
make sure that you subscribe to the GB News channel
right here on YouTube.
You can watch us live 24/7 across the whole world.
You can also check out exclusive content and catch up on previous episodes of your favourite shows.
Every day, we ask the questions
that you'd ask, so why not add your voice to the conversation in the comments section?
Don't forget to subscribe. We are GB News, Britain's news channel.
Every night at 11 on GB News, we bring you the next day's stories the day before.
Basically like time travel.
If it's a big story, we'll cover it, guaranteed. But we'll also have some fun along the way.
Big opinions, big laughs. Sometimes big hair.
This is Headliners, the paper review show that won't send you to sleep like the others will.
11 p.m, 7 nights a week. Join us.
Hello there, I'm Eamon Holmes.
And I'm Isabel Webster.
And we hope you can join us for
Breakfast with Eamon
and Isabel.
You make me laugh out loud, belly laugh.
Is that important first thing in the morning?
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's me trying to be deadly serious. News is a serious business.
Yeah, I have to rein you in sometimes.
Well, it doesn't stop us laughing at it. It doesn't stop us having an opinion on what's going on.
Yeah.
And it certainly will not stop us reflecting what you think.
Weekdays from 6 to 9:30 on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Yes, well, good morning, everyone. This is To The Point on GB News with me, Patrick Christie's, Ananaya Falarin-Aman on your TV, radio, and online. We're here with you all the way through midday.